The first thing the Falcon dropped on my head was a dead rabbit. I was standing in the middle of the ironwood courtyard, holding a stack of scrolls I'd been ordered to deliver to the War Council, trying very hard not to look like I was lost, because I absolutely was lost, when something warm, soft, and deeply, profoundly dead landed on top of my hair with a soft thump. I did not scream. I want to be clear about that. What I did was make a very controlled, very dignified sound of alarm, drop every single scroll, and spin around in a circle trying to see what had attacked me from above. The Falcon was sitting on the edge of the stone archway, watching me with the particular self-satisfaction that only birds of prey ever manage. It was enormous, the size of a small dog, with slate-gray wings and eyes so amber they looked lit from inside. Around its left leg was a thin band of hammered gold, and carved into that band, visible even from here, was the ironwood crest. The Alpha King's Falcon. The Alpha King's Falcon had dropped a rabbit on my head. I looked at the rabbit. I looked at the bird. The bird looked back at me with those unsettling amber eyes and ruffled its feathers once, the way a person might clear their throat before saying something important. Its head tilted to the side, a slow, deliberate movement that made it look less like a predator and more like something that was waiting for a reaction it had planned for. I started. "That," said a deep voice behind me, "is a gift." I turned. He was standing in the arch of the courtyard entrance, arms crossed, watching me with an expression I could not read at all. Cale Ironwood, Alpha King of the Northern Packs, the man who 3 days ago had pulled me out of a collapsed border tunnel by the wrist and hauled me to safety without saying a single word, then deposited me in a guest chamber and disappeared. I hadn't seen him since, which had been fine. More than fine. Excellent, actually. He was watching the Falcon with something that looked almost like exasperation. "His name is Ash," the Alpha King said. "He's—" A pause, something flickered across his face. "He's expressing approval." I looked down at the rabbit. "He killed something for me," I said. "He provides for those he considers." Another pause, longer this time. "Worthy." I had been living at the Ironwood Keep for exactly 72 hours. I was here because my Pax Alpha, my Uncle Brennan, had sent me as a diplomatic envoy after a border dispute that nearly started a war. I was here because I was the only person in our pack fluent in both Ironwood Treaty protocols and the Old Northern Signing Language, which meant I was technically valuable. I was here because it was either me or my cousin Dara, and Dara had fainted during the last council meeting and dropped an inkwell on the emissary from the Ashfall pack, so the choice had not been difficult. I was not here because anyone had expected me to matter to anyone, least of all to an Alpha King, whose Falcon was now staring at me like I was the most interesting thing it had ever seen. "I'm not going to eat a raw rabbit," I said. "No," the Alpha King agreed. He uncrossed his arms, pushed off the archway, and walked toward me. He stopped when he was close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, which was closer than any Alpha King had any business standing. "Ash has unusual judgment." Is that a compliment or an apology? Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I haven't decided. He crouched down and gathered my scattered scrolls without being asked, stacking them with the efficiency of someone who'd handled documents all his life. He held them out to me. I took them. Our fingers didn't touch, but it was close enough that I felt the warmth radiating off his hand, which was not something I needed to be noticing. "The War Council chamber is through the east corridor," he said. "Second door on the left. The third door is the armory. Don't open the third door by mistake. The weapons master has no sense of humor." He walked away before I could thank him. Above me, Ash the Falcon made a small sound that I could only describe as smug. That was the beginning. "My name is Soren Caldwell, and I am a translator, not a diplomat." This distinction matters because translators are supposed to be invisible. We sit at the edge of tables, We render one set of words into another. We make the machinery of negotiation function without becoming part of the mechanism. I had been doing this for 4 years. I was good at it. The invisibility had never bothered me. Ironwood Keep was the largest fortified holding in the Northern Territories, and the War Council chamber was, as the Alpha King had promised, the second door on the left. I found it without opening the armory, which I counted as a success. The room was long and stone-walled, full of counselors and military advisors, and the emissary from my uncle's pack, old Corvin, who had the measured disposition of someone who'd survived 30 years of treaty negotiations by never showing what he actually thought. He nodded at me when I came in. I took my assigned seat at the edge of the table. The Alpha King arrived 2 minutes later, and the room's entire energy reorganized around him the way rooms always did when the dominant predator entered. He sat at the head of the table and did not look at me, which was exactly correct and fine. I took out my translation notes and told myself to pay attention. The treaty negotiations concerned a strip of territory along the northern river boundary, 300 acres of land that both the Ironwood Pack and my uncle's Eastern Valley Pack had historical claim to, complicated by a water rights issue that went back 2 generations, and involved an agreement that had been made verbally, and was therefore only as reliable as the memories of the people who'd been present, most of whom were dead. My job was to translate the old Northern signing language for the Council's deaf member, render the formal treaty language into plain terms when the emissaries asked for clarification, and keep notes of any agreed amendments. I did all of this. I was professional and thorough. I translated 3.5 hours of negotiation and wrote 12 pages of amendment notes, and did not once think about silver-flecked gray eyes or warm hands gathering scrolls off cold stone. And at the end of the session, when everyone filed out, I stayed to collect the secondary documents and put them in order because that was my job. Ash was sitting on the windowsill when I looked up. I had not seen the bird come in. The window was high, the kind of narrow slot that was more architectural than functional. But there the Falcon was, watching me with the focused attention of something that had been watching for a while. "Shoo," I said. Ash did not shoo. "I'm working," I told it. Ash's head tilted at the same deliberate angle as before. I gathered my documents and left. The bird was still there when I pulled the door closed, and I was nearly certain I heard the soft, dry sound of it ruffling its feathers in a self-satisfied way, but I did not go back to check. The second thing Ash dropped on my head was a flower. A wildflower, specifically. One of the small blue ones that grew along the cliff paths above the keep, delicate as paper and smelling faintly of cold stone and open sky. I was sitting in the records hall, 3 days into treaty negotiations that were going slowly, translating a water rights clause that had 17 subclauses, and appeared to have been written by someone who hated clarity and wanted everyone else to share the experience, when the flower came through the open window and landed on my page. I looked up. Ash was perched on the windowsill, watching me with what I was beginning to recognize as his particular resting expression, calm, alert, and somehow superior. "You have got to be joking," I said. Ash tilted his head. I looked around the records hall. The treaty scribe, a wiry elder wolf named Corvin, was watching from across the room with an expression that suggested he was working hard not to laugh. "Has the Alpha King's bird ever done this before?" I asked. "Not in my memory," Corvin said carefully. "Ash is very selective." "Selective," I repeated. "He's bonded to Alpha Kale since they were both very young. When Ash approves of someone," Corvin paused in the way everyone seemed to pause when they approached this subject, like it was a gap in the floor they'd rather step around carefully. "It means something." "What does it mean?" Corvin returned to his own documents with the serene expression of a man who had decided to be elsewhere for this conversation. I couldn't say. I looked at the flower. It was genuinely beautiful, the kind of small, specific beauty that you only noticed if you were paying attention to the world, really paying attention, the way most people stop doing after childhood. The petals were paper-thin, and the blue of them was the exact blue of very deep water, and someone had seen it and thought of me. Or a bird had seen it and thought of me. It was hard to know which possibility was more alarming, and harder still to know which one I found more affecting. I put the flower between 2 pages of the treaty document, because I couldn't throw it away and I couldn't keep it loose, and I went back to the water rights clause and tried very hard not to think about silver-gray eyes, and the way a man could gather scattered scrolls like it was nothing and still somehow make it feel like something. That evening at dinner, the Alpha King sat at the head of the long table and did not look at me. The long table seated 30, which meant we were nowhere near each other, which was appropriate and correct. But Ash was perched on his usual stand near the fire, and the bird watched me steadily through the entire meal, and twice I caught the Alpha King's jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was very aware of this and was choosing not to address it. I ate my dinner and talked to the council members near me, a weapons engineer named Cyan who wanted to know about Eastern Valley metallurgy, and an elderly archive keeper named Felder who had opinions about treaty language and shared all of them. And I was professional and personable, and I did not think about any of it. I told myself that very firmly twice on the way back to my chamber. It helped a small amount. On my 8th day at Ironwood Keep, I accidentally walked into a sparring session. In my defense, the door was unlocked, and the hallway looked the same as every other hallway, which was a design failure on someone's part, and I was carrying 3 cups of tea because the kitchens had given me one for each diplomatic party as a gesture of mourning goodwill, and I had not figured out how to refuse without giving offense, so I was navigating a narrow corridor with 3 ceramic cups and a map that had already proven itself unreliable. I pushed open the door and found myself in the inner training yard. The inner training yard was currently occupied by the Alpha King, shirtless, mid-swing with a practice blade, and 2 of his senior warriors who both stopped and stared at me with the identical expression of people interrupted while watching something that required concentration. The Alpha King completed his swing. He did not stop mid-motion or look up. He finished what he'd started, and the practice blade connected with the training dummy so hard the stuffed torso split and the sawdust filling hit the floor in a soft cascade. Then he turned. His expression did that complicated thing it kept doing, starting toward the controlled blankness that was his default in the council chamber, and arriving somewhere else entirely, somewhere less controlled. "Envoy Sauron," he said. "I have tea," I said. I held up the cups. "I'm sorry, I had a map. The map was wrong." One of the warriors, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair who I'd gathered was the keep's weapons captain, made a sound that was clearly a suppressed laugh. "Captain Mara," the Alpha King said, in a tone that ended the laugh very effectively. I started to back out. "Stay," he said it simply, like it wasn't an order, but the word had enough weight that my feet stopped moving entirely without consulting me. He took a cloth from the weapons rack and wiped down the practice blade with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "The treaty has stalled over the water boundary. I'd like your read on it." My read, I had a read. I had a read that had been developing for 3 days, careful and uncomfortable, because it was going to cost his pack significant concessions on the northern tributary, and I had been trying to figure out how to present it diplomatically without softening it so much that the message was lost. "You've been translating both sides," he said. "You've read every version of the disputed clause. You've heard what both delegations say publicly, and you've taken amendment notes for everything said in between." He set the practice blade on the rack and looked at me directly. "I want to know what you think is fair, not what either delegation wants to hear, not what advances either pack's position. What's actually fair?" That was not what I expected. Not from an Alpha King in the middle of a treaty negotiation, where his pack had significantly more leverage. They usually wanted to know what they could extract, not what was equitable. I sat down on the training bench, still holding the 3 cups of tea, and I told him what I thought was fair. I laid out the full argument, the historical water use data, the population projections, the infrastructure maintenance obligations that the treaty's current wording would land entirely on one side, and the long-term instability that would create. I explained why the short-term gain wasn't worth the long-term cost. I used the plain language I'd been rendering into diplomatic circumlocution for a week, and it felt like setting down something heavy. He listened without interrupting, which was also not what I expected. He asked 2 questions, sharp, specific questions that showed he understood the subclauses better than he'd let on in the formal sessions. Then he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the practice yard floor, turning something over in his mind. "That's what I thought," he said. "I needed to hear someone else say it. Your delegation won't be pleased." "My delegation wants the short gain." He picked up his shirt from the weapons rack, gray linen, worn soft with use, and pulled it over his head, unhurried. "I want the peace to hold for 20 years. They're not the same objective." He looked at me. "Your uncle's emissary, he knows this too." "Corvin, he's known it since day one. He's been waiting to see which way your alpha wanted it to go. Then we'll resolve it tomorrow. I'll talk to my chief counselor tonight." I stood up to leave. I was almost to the door when Ash landed on my shoulder. I had not heard the bird enter. One moment there was a falcon-shaped absence in the world, and the next there was approximately 3 pounds of warm, alarming bird sitting on my left shoulder with its talons gripping carefully, doing no damage at all despite being very capable of damage. Its great slate-gray wings folded to its sides like it had been sitting on my shoulder all its life and intended to continue. The silence in the training yard was sudden and total. I turned my head very slowly. Ash was close enough that I could see my own face reflected in his amber eye, my slightly wide eyes, my very still expression. He made a small sound, not a screech, not a hunting cry, something softer and lower, almost conversational, like a greeting from someone who'd been waiting to give it for a while. "He's never done that," said Captain Mara. Her voice had gone careful and quiet in a way that was different from her earlier amusement. "Alpha, he's never done that to anyone. He'll take a perch from you, that's it." I looked at the Alpha King. He was staring at Ash with the overwhelmed stillness of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of something he thought he understood. Not blank, not controlled, genuinely, visibly overwhelmed in a way that he was not trying to hide, maybe because he didn't have time. "Ash," he said quietly. The Falcon looked at him, held the look for a long moment in the way animals held looks when they were communicating something they considered clear. Then the bird turned back to me and tucked his beak briefly, gently against my jaw, a touch so careful it could have been imagined, in a gesture that I somehow understood in that bone-deep way that shifter instinct worked, the way you understood dominance and challenge and welcome before you had words for them. "This is mine," the gesture said, "and she is too, now you know." Not the bird's, that wasn't the meaning. The bird was introducing. The bird was making a declaration on behalf of someone else. "I need to get back to the records hall," I said. My voice was very steady. I was proud of it. "There's a subclause I need to finish cross-referencing before the morning session." "Soren." The Alpha King said my name like he'd been holding it in his mouth for a while, turning it over quietly, and had finally stopped being careful about it. I transferred Ash from my shoulder to the weapons rack with more dignity than I felt, picked up my 3 cups of tea, which were now cold, and left the training yard. I walked down the hallway at a moderate pace that I maintained through considerable effort. I heard Captain Mara say something behind me, low and amused. I heard the Alpha King say nothing at all. I went back to the records hall and sat with the treaty documents for 2 hours without reading a single word. I found out about the bond on the 9th night. I couldn't sleep. This was becoming a pattern I was increasingly inclined to attribute to causes I wasn't ready to name. I'd gone to the Keep's library, because it was the only room I'd found where you could sit by a window and look out at the starfield without anyone coming to ask if you needed anything, to offer anything, to be helpful in ways that required me to be a person with normal responses. The northern sky was enormous. There was nothing between you and the dark up here except air, no city lights, no ridge lines high enough to cut the horizon. The stars were different shapes than they were in the eastern valleys, different arrangements, and I'd been spending my insomniac nights learning them. The Ironwood people had different names for the constellations. The one the Eastern Valley Pax called the Shepherd's Crook, Ironwood called the Alpha's Hand, which I thought said something about the difference between the packs that was both obvious and interesting. I'd been there an hour when I heard footsteps in the corridor, measured and unhurried, and the Alpha King appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of something hot, and an expression that suggested he had known I would be here, had been deciding for a while whether to come, and had arrived at his decision. He put 1 cup on the table near me, without asking if I wanted it. I did not say anything. He sat in the chair across the room and looked out the other window, the one facing west, toward the valleys. Ash started showing up at your chamber window 2 days before I pulled you out of that tunnel, he said. I turned to look at him. I didn't mention it to anyone, he said. I told myself it was coincidence. He hunts along the border territories sometimes. There's strong updraft off the ridge. It made sense he'd be ranging out there. A pause, quiet and careful. Then the tunnel collapsed and your pack's emergency signal went up, and Ash was moving before the scouts had finished reporting in. He already knew where you were. He was already going. Falcons don't work that way, I said. No, they don't. He was still looking out the west window, hands wrapped around his cup. I've had Ash for 22 years. He came to me when I was 12, the year before my father died. Ash was young then, 3 years old, newly trained. My father chose him because of his temperament. He said Ash had the particular quality of a creature who made decisions carefully and then held to them. He paused. I've had him for 22 years. He has done nothing in that time that I didn't understand. He looked at me. Until 8 days ago. The fire was low. The starfield through the window was very bright. Outside, the wind moved through the pines below the keep and made the sound it made, the low, continuous rush that was different from Eastern Valley wind, heavier, more purposeful. What happened 8 days ago? I asked, though I thought I knew, in the way you could know something and still need it to be said. 8 days ago I felt the mate bond, he said. For the first time, after 34 years. He said it the way you said something you'd been rehearsing in your head, carefully, without inflection, so the weight of it didn't get into your voice and make the other person feel the pressure of it. I was at the training yard when the signal came in from the border. I felt it before I knew who you were, before I'd seen your face. Just the direction of it, pulling north toward the ridge. He stopped. And Ash was already moving. He had already known. He was already trying to. He rubbed the back of his neck with a short, frustrated motion. He was already trying to court you on my behalf, apparently, since I was taking too long to do anything about it myself. I sat very still with my cup between my hands and the fire low, and the stars very large. The rabbit, I said. An offering. Something moved through his expression, a rueful edge, not quite mortification but adjacent to it, to demonstrate provision, that he can, that the one he's vouching for can provide. He said it plainly, without flinching from how it sounded. I didn't ask him to do that. I didn't ask him to do any of it. He made his own assessment. The flower. Affection, expression of care for what the recipient values. Ash would have observed that you spend time at the windows and spend time outside when you're not working. He'd have noticed what you were looking at. He paused. He was improvising, I think, based on a concept he understood in his own terms. The meaning was correct. The execution was another pause. He was working with what he had. He sat on my shoulder this afternoon. A claim. His voice had gone very quiet. That was him telling everyone present that you were under his protection, his endorsement, which is, in the language of a bonded familiar, the same as saying you're under mine. He looked at his cup. He was not subtle. I looked at my own hands for a long moment. I was 26 years old. I had felt the pull of attraction before, had had 2 relationships that were good and real and honest, and had ended for reasons that had nothing to do with failure. But the mate bond, that specific bone-deep recognition, I had told myself, quietly, in the private accounting I did with myself when I was honest, that it might not come for me. That some people built good and full lives without it, and that was not a loss, just a different shape. I had told myself that, and believed it mostly. I felt it too, I said. When you pulled me out of the tunnel, I thought it was the fear, the adrenaline, the relief, the way extreme situations make everything feel heightened. I went over it afterward. I tried to find the other explanation. So did I, he said, for about 4 hours. And then Ash came home from the border and sat on my arm and looked at me, and I knew. Outside, somewhere in the dark above the keep, I heard the sound of large wings. Soft and purposeful, the rhythm of a bird that was not hunting but circling, the way Ash had circled us in the courtyard, keeping watch. The sound was unhurried, patient in the particular way that certain creatures were patient when they knew what the outcome was going to be and were simply waiting for the people to arrive at it. You don't have to do anything with this, the Alpha King said. The bond isn't a command. I know what some alphas, I know what the stories say about mate bonds and alpha authority and what's expected. His jaw worked once. I am not that kind of alpha, and this is not that kind of keep. You came here as an envoy. Your work here is your own. Whatever happens with the treaty, whatever you decide about anything else, you leave when your work is done. That belongs to you. I looked at him. He was looking at his cup. He had the careful, contained expression of a man who was working very hard at something, and what he was working at, I understood then, was this: not wanting, or rather, wanting very much and refusing to let it become pressure, refusing to let the weight of what he felt become the thing that made the decision for me. I thought about the Eastern Valleys, my Uncle Brennan's practical face when he'd sent me here, the slight apology in it, the awareness that he was asking something of me. The small house I had at the edge of the packed territory, with the herb garden and the big desk, and the wall of treaty records that I'd been adding to for 4 years. The life I'd built there, quietly on purpose. Ash doesn't seem to have gotten the message about not applying pressure, I said. A sound escaped him. Almost a laugh, not quite, but almost, which was different from the controlled half-smiles I'd been watching him deploy in public. No, Ash does what Ash decides. He decided 3 weeks ago, apparently, and has been implementing his decision with considerable consistency. He's going to drop something else on my head tomorrow, isn't he? Almost certainly. The almost laugh again, brief and genuine and warm, and something in it broke the careful distance I'd been maintaining for 9 days. It was the wrong thing to do, letting a warmth like that in, but I didn't pull back in time. I found feathers on the sill of the East guest chamber 2 nights ago. He rubbed the back of his neck again, that same gesture. I think he's been decorating. He's been decorating my room. In his understanding of what decorating means, which is placing things he considers valuable, a pause. I am very sorry. I laughed. I didn't plan to, it came out of me whole and genuine, the kind of laugh that happened when something was both funny and true and you were too tired to keep it in. The sound of it in the quiet library surprised both of us. He looked up, and for the first time since I'd arrived at Ironwood Keep, there was nothing careful about his face at all. Not the council chamber blank, not the controlled public composure. Just him looking at me laughing, and the expression on his face was something I was going to spend a very long time trying to forget. I did not think I was going to succeed at that. We stayed in the library until the fire went out, talking about the treaty and the pacts and the history of the water boundary. and about the northern star patterns and what the Ironwood people called them, and twice more about Ash. And I did not think about the bond at all because it was there in the room with us constantly and didn't need to be thought about. When I finally went back to my chamber, I found 3 more wildflowers on the windowsill and 1 small gray feather, and I put them all carefully aside. I did not throw them away. The third thing Ash dropped on my head was a piece of blue glass. See, glass, smoothed by water over decades, the color of deep ocean, the kind of thing you only found if you went to the coast, which was half a continent away and a 3-day flight for a bird with strong wind behind it. I caught it this time, because I'd learned to watch for the shadow of wings and the slight acceleration of wind that preceded a delivery. I stood in the courtyard holding it up to the morning light, watching the color of it change as the sun moved through, and I did not know what to feel about the fact that I found it genuinely, helplessly beautiful. Ash regarded me from the archway with those amber eyes and said nothing. "Did you fly to the coast for this?" I said, not a question. Ash ruffled his feathers once. That's actually remarkable," I said, despite myself. "That's completely ridiculous, but it's remarkable." "He didn't," said Kale from the inner courtyard door. He stopped when he saw what I was holding, and something passed through his face, surprise, and then a rueful, helpless warmth that he no longer seemed to be trying to suppress entirely. "He did, didn't he?" "He apparently did. I didn't ask him to." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He crossed the courtyard. Unlike the first day, unlike the carefully maintained distance of every conversation we'd had in the first week, he stopped close enough that I could have reached out and touched the collar of his shirt without fully extending my arm. "Though I'll admit," he said quietly, looking at the glass in my hand, "that his taste is better than mine would have been. You would have sensed something." I would have composed approximately 7 drafts of something, and discarded all of them on the grounds that they were too much or not enough, or poorly timed. His voice was dry and honest at once, which was a combination I had spent 9 days trying to build a defense against and had apparently failed. I would have arrived at your door eventually with nothing but a lot of edited restraint and very poor timing. That's almost endearing. It's embarrassing. Yes, I said, but still. He held out his hand, not reaching for the glass, not taking, just his palm open, offered, waiting to see what I'd do with it. I looked at his hand. I looked at him. I thought about everything I'd told myself about leaving when the treaty was done, about the Eastern Valleys, about not making decisions based on things that were still raw and new and possibly distorted by proximity. I put the sea glass in his palm. I watched his fingers close around it. And then, because I was tired of being careful, and the bond had been humming between us for 9 days, and Ash had apparently flown half a continent because he thought I should have something beautiful, I put my hand over his. His breath changed. I felt it, the slight, involuntary catch, and then the slow release, like something that had been held against tension for a long time finally loosening. His hand turned slightly under mine, not pulling away but orienting toward. "I'm not staying," I said. "My pack needs me. The treaty work ends when it ends and then I go home. That's not negotiable." "I know. And I don't know anything about being part of an Alpha King's household. I'm a translator. I have a house and a desk and 4 years of treaty records and a herb garden that needs attention." "I know," he said again, and there was nothing in his voice but patience, steady and real. "I'd need to go back first, settle things, brief my uncle, make sure the Eastern Valley Treaty implementation is going to hold without me present." I was listing things, which was what I did when I was nervous, and I was aware that I was doing it. And then I'd need to come back and see whether any of this, whether it translates outside the specific conditions of treaty negotiations, and a very opinionated bird. "It would," he said. "I'm reasonably sure. A pause. I'm very sure, but I understand the principle. You understand the principle. You want to know that it's real and not the bond talking, that the bond is confirmation of something, not the creation of it. He met my eyes. I've been thinking about that too. I looked at him for a long moment. At this man who'd pulled me out of a collapsed tunnel and said nothing, who had listened to my honest assessment of his treaty without flinching, who had chosen the peace that would hold over the gain that wouldn't, who said things directly and plainly when he said them at all, and who had apparently spent 9 days watching his Falcon court me on his behalf and been simultaneously embarrassed by it, and unable to stop it because Ash had made up his own mind. "All right," I said. "All right. I go home when the treaty is done. I come back after we see." "Yes." Something moved through his face, large and quiet and not hidden, because he wasn't hiding things anymore. "Yes." "That." Above us, Ash launched from the archway and made 2 wide circles above our heads, his wings catching the morning light and throwing a slow-moving shadow across the courtyard stones. And the sound he made was not hunting, not alarm, not the soft conversational sounds he'd been making at me all week. It was something old and clear and carrying, the sound of a creature who had known what the outcome would be and had simply been waiting for the people to arrive at it. I held onto Cale Ironwood's hand in the courtyard and watched his Falcon circle the blue morning sky, and thought, 9 days ago I was lost in the dark of a collapsed tunnel with stone on every side and no way to know which direction was out, and then a hand reached in and found me, and I thought that was the whole story. A rescue complete, a small chapter opened and closed. It was not the whole story. The treaty finalized on the 12th day. The water rights clause came out the way it should, fair to both pacts, structurally sound, built for 20 years of stability instead of 3 years of advantage, followed by a dispute more difficult than this one. The Ironwood delegation grumbled with the specific contained displeasure of people who knew they'd given up something real and understood why, and weren't ready to say so publicly. Old Corvin looked at the final document, and then looked at me across the table and nodded once, the nod of a man who recognized that something had been done correctly. The signing ceremony was formal and full. The Alpha King sat at the head of the council table in his full regalia, gray and silver, the Ironwood crest on his shoulder. I sat at my designated envoy's position, and translated the final oath language into the Old Northern signing for the Ashfall Council member, who had been struggling with the formal dialect all week, and I kept my eyes on my work and performed my function with the professional precision I'd been managing for 12 days. Ash was on his stand in the corner. When the ink dried on the last page, the bird made a single sharp sound, not loud, but carrying, the kind of sound that cuts through ambient noise, and half the council startled. A candle flame across the room bent sideways and came back. "My apologies," the Alpha King said, in the dry tone of a man who was not sorry at all. "He approves of the outcome." Corvin, beside me, made a sound that I recognized as a carefully suppressed laugh. Afterward, in the brief, busy chaos of departures and formal farewells, and the packing of treaty documents into courier cases, Cale found me in the stone corridor outside the council chamber. There was no ceremony and no audience, just him and me and the corridor wall, and the sound of boot heels on stone from whoever was passing in the adjacent hallway. He had a small bundle in his hands, wrapped in plain brown cloth, tied simply, the kind of package that contained something private. "From Ash," he said. "I intercepted it before he could deploy it." I unwrapped it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with a map on it, hand-drawn, careful and detailed, showing the full territory between Ironwood Keep and the eastern valleys. The clearest route was marked in a darker line. At both ends of the route at the keep, and at the approximate location of my uncle's holding in the valleys, there was a small drawing of a falcon in flight. The drawings were simple and exact, the kind of drawings someone did who looked at things carefully before putting them down. He drew this, I said. He supervised while I drew it. Cale's expression had that warm helplessness to it again, the look he'd stopped trying to conceal. He was quite specific. He rejected the first version because I'd marked the western pass instead of the ridge path. He indicated his preference clearly. He knocked my pen off the desk 4 times until I switched routes. I folded the map carefully. I put it inside my jacket. 2.5 days, I said. If the pass is clear. It's clear, I asked Cyan this morning. I adjusted my jacket, feeling the slight weight of the paper. And then a week at home, reports to file, my uncle to brief, the treaty implementation plan to hand off. I looked at him. And then I'd like to come back. The East Guest Chamber will be ready, he said. I'll have the records hall cleared. The treaty will need, there are implementation details, questions of. Cale, I said. He stopped. I'm not coming back for the treaty. The careful face came apart entirely and quietly, the way a door came open when you finally found the right key. Nothing dramatic, just the simple movement of something that had been closed now opening. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. One touch, unhurried, certain in the way that only things that have been thought about very carefully were certain. Above us, from somewhere in the rafters or the open sky beyond the corridor window, Ash made a long, liquid, deeply self-satisfied sound. He's going to be insufferable about this, Cale said. He already has been, for 12 days. 11. He took the first day to assess the situation. That's very efficient of him. Cale laughed, a real laugh, not the almost laugh, the actual thing. It was deep and genuine and brief, the kind of laugh you heard from someone who laughed fully when they laughed, which meant they didn't do it lightly. I filed the sound of it carefully and deliberately, the way I filed important documents, because I was going to need it on the road. Come back soon, he said. 4 days, I said, maybe 3. I walked to the outer gate of Ironwood Keep, and Ash was waiting for me there, perched on the stone post of the gate arch, watching the road. He dropped from the post as I approached and landed on my shoulder with his careful grip, folded his wings, and settled himself with the air of a creature who had things arranged exactly as he'd intended. I carried him through the gate and along the ridge path, and he stayed on my shoulder for the first mile, long enough that I felt the warmth of him against my neck and the occasional small movement of his head as he watched the terrain. And then he lifted off in a single strong wing beat and caught the updraft off the ridge. He circled, once, twice, wide and slow, and then he turned north back toward the keep, and I watched him until he was a small point against the gray sky, and then I could not see him anymore. I faced the road ahead. 2.5 days, 1 week, then back. Some distances were not really distances at all. They were just the space between one thing and what came next. The 4th thing Ash dropped on my head was a letter. I was back in the eastern valleys, 11 days after leaving the keep, sitting in my uncle's study going over the water rights implementation records, because the treaty was signed, but implementation plans didn't execute themselves. Uncle Brennan had been watching me for 2 days with the expression of a man who had information he was waiting for me to share, and I had been giving him the treaty reports in thorough, accurate, complete detail that happened to contain no personal information whatsoever. The window tapped. I knew that tap. I'd been hearing it in my memory for 11 days. I opened the window and Ash stepped inside with the complete assurance of a creature who had never been refused entry anywhere and did not intend to start. He picked his way across my document stacks with his talons, remarkably careful, for a bird of prey, and settled on the edge of my desk with the air of someone who had arrived right on schedule. Tucked under the gold band on his leg was a small rolled scroll. I unrolled it. Cale's handwriting, careful, slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught to write precisely and had never fully loosened. The letter said, Ash refused to wait for me to decide whether to send this. He may have a point. Below it, in writing that was slightly less precise, written faster, before the editing instinct could engage. The keep is very quiet. The records hall has all your notes in it. I haven't moved them. The east window still has the blue flower you pressed between the treaty pages. Ash brought it in and put it on the sill. I thought you should know. I haven't sent him. He went on his own. Okay. I sat with the letter for a long time. The eastern valleys were quiet too, in their familiar way, the sounds I'd grown up with, known all my life. I looked around my uncle's study, at my 4 years of careful work stacked on the shelves, at the treaty documents on the desk, at the pen in my hand. I thought about quiet keeps and untouched notes and a man who edited his drafts 7 times and still couldn't always say the thing directly, but had sent his Falcon across 3 days of territory to say it for him. I thought about a pressed flower on a windowsill, put there by a bird who had decided what mattered. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Tell him the eastern valleys are also very quiet, and I've been thinking about sea glass, and I'll be back in 3 days if the pass stays clear. I paused, then added, also tell him thank you for the map. I used the ridge path. He was right about the route. I rolled the paper and tucked it under the gold band on Ash's leg. The bird looked at me with those amber eyes and held the look for a long moment, and if a falcon could look satisfied, could look like a creature who had put significant effort into a project and was watching it arrive at its intended conclusion, that was the look. That was precisely the look. You're entirely too pleased with yourself, I told him. Ash lifted one foot and set it down again, in what I had begun to read as the avian equivalent of a shrug. Go on then, I said. He launched from my windowsill in a rush of gray wings and cold valley air, and I watched him angle north and catch the morning wind, growing smaller against the sky with every wing beat, heading for the ridge and the high passes and the enormous northern stars. I turned back to my desk. I had implementation records to finish, reports to file, a herb garden that needed attention. I had 3 days of work to compress into 2. I pulled the implementation records toward me and picked up my pen. 3 days, maybe 2.5. Some spaces were built to be crossed. On the 10th morning, I went to find Ash. Not because I planned to. I was walking the keep's outer wall path, something I'd taken to doing in the early mornings because it was the only time the keep was quiet enough to think, and because the view from the north-facing stretch showed the full breadth of the valley below and the mountain range beyond it, white-capped and enormous, the kind of scale that reminded you that human concerns were specific and manageable, and that the world was much larger than any of them. I had been walking the outer wall path for 9 days. On the 10th day, Ash found me on it. Or I found him. He was perched on the outer battlement at the north corner, which was the exact point where the view was best, and he was sitting in profile with his chest to the wind and his wings slightly lifted, and the way he was sitting made me think, for a moment, absurdly of someone at a window, looking out, thinking. I sat down on the battlement a few feet from him. We were high enough that the wind had teeth, and it moved through my hair and over the stone and carried the smell of pine resin and cold water. Ash looked at me sideways. I know, I said. I know what you're doing. I want to be clear that I know what you're doing. Ash looked back at the view. You're very good at it, I said. I'm not saying you're not good at it. The sea glass was genuinely extraordinary, and the rabbit was, you meant well with the rabbit. The falcon made the small low sound. I just want you to know, I said, that you don't have to work this hard. I stopped. The wind moved. I'm not leaving because I want to leave. I'm leaving because there are things that need to be done and I'm the person responsible for them, and because I think the right way to handle something this significant is carefully, with time, with thought. Ash regarded me with the amber eye. You understand that, right? I said. You chose a careful man, Whatever you found in me that you thought was right for him, I think careful is part of it. I think considered is part of it. I looked out at the valley. So trust the process. I'll be back. Ash was quiet for a moment. Then he moved along the battlement toward me, one step and then another, and settled himself approximately 8 inches from my left hand. Not touching. Close. We sat on the outer wall in the cold morning wind for the better part of an hour, the Falcon and I, watching the valley below go through its morning business. The smoke beginning from the lower village cook fires, the distant movement of the pack's patrol riders along the tree line, the hawks working the ridge thermals in wide, lazy circles. I had not expected to find this place comfortable. It had happened gradually, day by day, the way things did when you weren't watching for them. When I finally stood to go, Ash lifted off without ceremony and wheeled away north, back toward whatever he had to do, and I watched him go with the particular feeling of someone who'd had a real conversation and knew it. On my 10th evening, I had dinner in the records hall. I did not plan this. What happened was that I was working late on a set of boundary survey documents that were badly organized and needed to be cross-referenced before the morning session, and the hall's attendant brought a dinner tray without being asked, and I ate it at the desk because stopping seemed inefficient. I was halfway through the boundary surveys when I heard a knock at the open door, and the Alpha King appeared, carrying his own dinner tray, looking at me with an expression that asked a question without saying it. I moved a stack of documents to clear the corner of the desk. He sat down. We worked for a while in the comfortable quiet of people who are doing different tasks in the same room and have stopped needing to fill the silence with anything. He was reviewing military deployment reports. I could see from the occasional glance, the kind of review that required concentration and produced no conversation, which suited me. I sorted boundary surveys. He annotated patrol schedules. The fire in the records hall was well maintained. The hall was warm, and outside the narrow windows the northern night was very dark and very clear. "The first day I came to this keep," I said eventually, "your weapons captain told me the third door in the east corridor was the armory. She looked like she was testing me." He did not look up from his papers. "She was. She tests everyone who comes through on diplomatic business. She wants to know how you respond to directions you can't verify." "What's the correct response?" "Following them without asking why." He turned a page. "You followed them," she mentioned it. "Favorably." "She said you weren't stupid." He glanced up. "From Mara, that's a citation." I laughed quietly into my documents. "What happens to the people who open the third door?" "Nothing harmful. Davin is the weapons master. He has no sense of humor, but he won't bite anyone who opens the wrong door by mistake." He paused. "He did confiscate an emissary's boot once. The emissary had said something disparaging about the northern forging tradition in Davin's hearing. He held the boot until the emissary apologized to his face. He confiscated one boot. Left the other just to make the point." He turned another page. "Davin has his own logic." I was smiling at my documents and knew it and didn't try to stop. "Your keep is full of people with their own logic." "Yes," something in his voice went warmer. "I find it's better that way. People who follow only the logic that's given to them are useful in certain circumstances and entirely useless in most others. Like treaty negotiations. Like everything that matters." He put down his deployment report and looked at me. "I've been thinking about what you said in the training yard, about what was fair." "Did you talk to your chief counselor?" "Last night, he disagreed initially. I let him. He ran the long-term numbers himself and came back this morning with a different position." He looked slightly satisfied. "It took him 3 hours. He's an honest man. He's a thorough one, which in my experience is better." He picked up his report again. "He said you presented the case clearly in the session. He also said, and this is a direct quote, that he'd never seen an envoy translate their own side's position with that degree of critical distance. I wasn't being critical. He meant it as high praise. He means that you translated what each side was saying rather than what each side wanted the other to hear. He looked at me. That's rare. Most translators adjust for tone. I thought about this. I adjust for register and formality, not for substance. Yes, he noticed. A pause. I noticed too, the first day. The fire settled. Outside, the wind shifted, and the pines below the keep moved in it. I looked at my boundary surveys and thought about the specific and particular quality of being seen clearly by someone who had reason to look carefully. The water rights clause, I said. When this is done, and the treaty holds, if it holds the way we've designed it, that's 20 years of peace on the northern border. 2 generations of pack members who don't have to know what the alternative felt like. Yes, he said. That's the work, I said. That's what it's for. I looked at him. Your pack and mine both, that's what we're here to do. He held my eyes for a long moment. There was something in his expression, not the rueful warmth, not the overwhelmed stillness, something steadier. Recognition. Yes, he said again. Exactly that. We finished our dinners and our documents, and at some point the fire burned low enough that we both noticed it at the same time, and Cale stood to add fuel to it with the ease of someone who had tended his own fires all his life and didn't wait for someone else to do it. And I watched him and thought about the shape of the next 20 years and the shape of the years after that. And I thought that there were worse things, much worse things, than a life built alongside someone who chose the peace that would hold. I was still thinking about it when I went to bed, and I was still thinking about it on the road home, and I was still thinking about it when Ash arrived through my window with Cale's letter in his leg band, 12 days later, and I found that the thinking had only gotten clearer with distance. Some things you needed to step away from to see the whole of. The ridge path home had been cold and clear, the way Cale had predicted, and I had spent 2.5 days walking it with the map in my pocket and the memory of sea glass and wildflowers and a falcon's amber eye. And the further I got from Ironwood Keep, the more certain I became that I had not left anything behind. I had only put distance between myself and what I was returning to. In the eastern valleys on the 12th day, before Ash arrived, I found myself in the treaty records room. I went in because I was filing the final Ironwood negotiation documents, which belonged in the Northern Territory section, 3rd shelf from the left. 4 years of work on those shelves. The Thornfield Water Compact, the Ashfall Mineral Rights Settlement, the Gray Mountain Grazing Rotation Agreement that had taken 8 months and 3 failed drafts before anyone found language that both sides could sign. I ran my hand along the spines and thought about the 12 days that had just ended and the 12 that had just begun. My Uncle Brennan appeared in the doorway while I was standing there. He was a large, quiet man, my uncle, the kind of alpha who led by consistency rather than display, which I had always respected. He looked at me and then at the shelf of Northern documents and then back at me. "Good treaty," he said. "It's a fair one," I said. "That's the same thing when it holds." He came into the room. "You'll want to go back." It was not a question. "In a few days," I said. "There are implementation details that need." "There are always implementation details," he said. "I have a records keeper. I have Corvin, who is more than capable of managing implementation." He looked at me steadily. "What I don't have is anyone who speaks both Northern signing language and Ironwood Treaty Protocol, and a standing invitation from the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, and a bonded Falcon who visited my keeps, Eves 3 times in the last 2 weeks looking for you." I looked at him. "Ash came here," I said. 3 times. Sat on the gate arch for an hour the first time, left, came back 2 days later." He paused. "I know what an alpha's bonded familiar does and doesn't do. I know what it means when one comes ranging for a person." He crossed his arms. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know, Soren." I was going to tell you. I know you were being careful, that's how you do things. He uncrossed his arms. It's also how he does things from what I understand. The northern packs have had Cale Ironwood for 12 years. He's not reckless. He's not careless. He chose the fair treaty over the advantageous one, which tells me everything I need to know about how he weighs things. I thought about the training yard, the two questions, the chief counselor who went home and ran the numbers himself. He's a good man, I said. Yes, my uncle said simply. I thought so, I hoped so, that's why I sent you. I looked at him, you knew. I hoped it's different. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Go file the documents, go finish what needs to be finished here, and then go back. He paused in the doorway. Take the ridge path, it's faster. I stood in the treaty records room after he left and looked at the northern shelf. 12 days ago, I had been sitting in a library with the enormous northern stars filling the window, listening to a careful man tell me something he'd been holding carefully for 9 days, and I had laughed in the dark and felt something let go that I hadn't known I was holding. 14 days before that, I'd been in a collapsed tunnel with stone pressing in from every side. No light, no direction, just the sound of my own breathing, and the knowledge that the situation was bad. And then a hand. I filed the Northern Treaty documents in the Northern Territories section, third shelf from the left. I labeled the spine carefully, the way I labeled all of them: date, parties, subject, status. Status settled. I put the pen down. 3 days, maybe 2. Ash arrived through the window the next morning, which I had not expected and should have. He stepped onto my desk and I unrolled Cale's letter and read it twice, and then I wrote my reply with my hand steady and my mind clear, and I tucked it under the gold band on his leg. He looked at me with those amber eyes, the look of a creature for whom this had never been in doubt. I know, I said. You were right, you've been right the whole time. Are you satisfied? Ash made the long, liquid, self-satisfied sound, the one I'd first heard over the courtyard when Cale and I stood in the morning light with our hands laced together. The sound that meant everything is as it should be. I had learned by then to trust that sound. Go on then, I said, go home. Tell him I'll be 2 days behind you. He went. I turned back to my desk, to the reports and records and the life I was settling before I began the next thing, and I worked with the particular efficiency of someone who has somewhere to be. 2 days, the ridge path, the enormous northern stars. I was already halfway there. On the second day of the ride north, I stopped at the top of the ridge pass. The pass was the highest point of the route, the moment where the eastern valley dropped away behind you and the northern territory opened ahead, and for one brief stretch you were between both worlds with the sky enormous in every direction. It was cold up there even in the shoulder season, wind-scoured and bright, the kind of clean cold that had no softness in it. I stopped because the view required it. Not practically, my horse didn't need rest at this point, but because you couldn't come through that pass and not stop for a moment with it. The valley I was leaving, cupped and green, familiar in every particular. The territory I was heading toward, larger and more angular, the keep visible as a pale mark on the ridge 8 miles north. 8 miles. I had spent 12 days in that keep and come away with a fair treaty and a sea glass stone, and a map drawn under Falcon's supervision, and something I didn't have a clean word for yet, something that required more time before it had a name. The bond had a name. The bond was the bond, ancient and specific, and not something you could mistake for anything else once you understood what it was, but the thing I was riding toward was bigger than the bond. The bond was recognition. What I was riding toward was the choice I was making with the recognition. Ash found me on the ridge. I don't know where he came from, whether he'd been tracking my route from Ironwood, or whether he'd simply known, the way he seemed to know things, that I'd be at the pass at this hour. He came from the north and dropped in a long, controlled glide and landed on the saddle pommel in front of me, gripped it, and looked at me with those amber eyes. He had nothing to deliver, no scroll under the band, no gift. He had just come. "Coming to escort me in," I said. Ash looked north, then looked back at me. "All right," I said. He lifted off the pommel and rode the wind ahead of me, not far, close enough to track, far enough to lead. He moved the way falcons moved in flight, with the specific, unhurried efficiency of a creature that knew exactly what it was built for and had never needed to question it. He caught thermals and let them carry him, and when the wind dropped he worked his wings, and when it rose again, he spread them wide and let the air do what air did. I followed him down the north slope of the ridge, through the stands of pine that smelled of cold resin, across the stone bridge over the border tributary. The tributary that was at the center of the water rights clause that I had spent 12 days arguing toward fairness, and up the long approach to Ironwood Keep. The gate was open. Captain Mara was standing at the outer gate with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had lost a bet. Behind her, the weapons master Davin was standing with both arms at his sides looking professionally neutral, which meant he had opinions he was not expressing. "Envoy Soren," Mara said. "Captain," I said. 2 days, she tilted her head. I said 3, Davin said 2. Davin is annoyingly correct. "The ridge path is faster than the pass," I said. "Alpha Kale said you'd take the ridge path." Mara uncrossed her arms. "He's in the council chamber. He's been doing administrative work for 2 days, which means he's been working at about half his usual speed and looking at the gate approximately once an hour." "You've been watching." "Someone has to," she stepped aside. "Welcome back, Envoy. The East Guest Chamber is ready. Records Hall is clear." A pause, barely perceptible. For what it's worth, Ash chose well. He always does, but this time particularly. I looked at her. She had the expression of someone who had served the same Alpha for 12 years and had been waiting for this to happen for most of them. Not waiting with impatience, with the quiet readiness of someone who knew the importance of what they were waiting for. "Thank you," I said. I left my horse with the stable attendant and walked through the outer keep, past the courtyard where I'd first had a rabbit dropped on my head, past the records hall, past the east corridor where the second door was the council chamber and the third was the armory. I pushed open the council chamber door. Kale was standing at the long table, looking at a deployment map spread across its surface, the kind of looking you did when you weren't actually looking at the thing, but were using the act of looking at it as an anchor while your mind was elsewhere. He looked up when the door opened. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Ash landed on the back of the nearest chair and tucked his wings with the decisive finality of a creature who had completed what he set out to do. 2 days, Kale said. "The ridge path," I said. "You were right about the route." He smiled, the full thing, not the controlled half version, not the warm helplessness, the real one. It changed his face entirely in the way that the real smile always did with people who were careful with theirs. I crossed the council chamber and stopped at the table across from him. "I told my uncle," I said. "How did he take it?" "He told me Ash had been visiting the Eastern Valley Gate Arch for 2 weeks. I put my hands on the table. "You sent him." "I didn't send him." He looked at Ash, who was sitting on the chair back with magnificent unconcern. "He went. I noticed he was ranging south and I chose not to interfere." "That's nearly the same thing." "It's meaningfully different." He came around the end of the table unhurried and stopped close in the way he'd stopped close in the courtyard on the morning of the sea glass, close enough that the distance between us was something I could resolve with a small movement. "Ash makes his own choices. I make mine." He looked at me steadily. "I choose this. I've been clear about it. I wanted to be clear and not pressuring." "You've been very restrained," I said. "I've been trying." It showed. I looked at him. At the silver-flecked gray eyes and the careful face that wasn't careful right now, that was just open and real and waiting. "Stop trying," I said. He put his hands on my face, both of them, gentle and certain, and kissed me. It was not a restrained kiss. It had 12 days of edited drafts in it and 9 days of carefully not wanting to visibly, and it was warm and real and true, the kind of thing that was exactly what it was without apology. Ash made the sound, the long, liquid, satisfied sound, the one that meant everything is as it should be. I laughed against Cale's mouth. He pulled back enough to look at me, and his expression, unguarded, radiant, helplessly warm, was the one I'd been trying to commit to memory since the library on the 9th night. I didn't need to commit it to memory anymore. He's going to be impossible now, Cale said. He's been impossible for 2 weeks. I looked at the Falcon on the chair back. He earned it. Ash ruffled his feathers once, with the precise and magnificent satisfaction of a creature who had decided something, pursued it with full commitment, and arrived at the correct outcome. He absolutely had. And the thing about outcomes that were correct was that they were only the beginning of everything that came next. The treaty held and the water ran, and the 2 packs found 20 years of peace along the border. And the Eastern Valley translator who became something else, something more, something she hadn't planned and was glad of, learned the Northern Star names one by one. And the keep became as familiar as home, because home was not a place you were born to but a thing you built, carefully. In the company of people who understood the difference between the short gain and the thing that held. Ash circled overhead at all of it. He had known from the beginning. He always did.